friends. I am Pastor Robert Abner, and I serve Lutheran Church of the Cross in Muncie, Indiana, and Grace Village, the Lutheran Episcopal Presbyterian campus ministry at Ball State University. Good to be with you again today as I'm working on bringing some video devotions during this time of pandemic. Most of you who follow my channel or know me on Facebook, you know the routine, so no need to spend too much time on that. Today, I'm going to break things up a little bit. I know that for the last few weeks I've been focusing on days of commemoration and saints who have gone before us, but I finally had some time and some energy to do a little work to answer a write-in question. And so a member of the congregation didn't necessarily write in, just saw me in person and asked me. But today's topic, very interesting, always controversial, but it's the idea of cults and what's the difference between a cult and a religion, and what are some markers that would typically tell you that something is a cult. So let's explore that just a little bit. Again, I always say this is not a doctoral dissertation. This is just some armchair quarterback work that I've done, looking up taking my knowledge from what I've studied in the past and understood, but also doing just a little research to see what I can offer to those of you watching or listening at home. So take a minute to yourself and think about what you would think is the difference between a cult and a religion. The term cult has not always been used derogatory. It's maybe just been used as a label in the religious world. It was originally used with this idea for an idea of a formal religious veneration. And so, when I bring up some of these saints that the church remembers, in their time and place after their death, or even today, based on what village they were from in Italy or Central America, there's a lot of devotion to that saint. And I think we have to walk that back just a little bit. In my tradition, in the Lutheran Church, when we talk about a saint, we are talking about a saint can be anyone who is justified by God. A saint is, every Christian is a saint, technically, right? Where that gets elevated is in some different church, specifically the Roman Catholic Church. They actually have veneration of saints, or they have, what's the word? These saints are canonized? Is that the word? And they have feast days. And so it's two different schools of thought. When, in our tradition as the Lutheran Church, when we think of saints and commemorate saints and remember saints, we are doing that from a perspective of we give thanks for their life lived out in serving the gospel. And so we look to them as kind of champions of the faith, in that they did such a good job in mimicking Jesus in their time and place. And so we too, we give thanks for their life, and we see their examples, but their examples ultimately point us to Jesus. That's a quick and dirty breakdown of a Lutheran view of saints. Whereas from a Roman Catholic point of view, there is the idea of where, now this is where things get mixed up, because people think that Catholics worship saints, and that's not the case. Roman Catholic people do not worship saints, which we'll get to that in just a minute too, as we're heading down this trail. What is common in the Roman Catholic Church is to ask a saint to pray for you. And the ideology behind it is that if I would ask a living person to pray for me, why could I not ask someone who is dead and on that side of the kingdom, on that in the church triumphant, as we call it? Remember, the church here and now, me and you, we're in the church militant. Those who have gone before us are in the church triumphant. And so if we can ask someone here and now in the church militant to pray for us, why would we not also ask someone who is in the church triumphant to pray for us? And that opens up lots of doors about what happens when we die, and heaven, hell, and purgatory, and soul sleep, and everything in between. We're not doing that today. Just to say that the misconception is that Roman Catholic people worship saints, but in reality, they are asking the saints to intercede for them in prayer. Okay, now, why I told you all of that, I had to tell you that so I can tell you this. Why I told you all of that is to come back to this idea of cults. And so cults would have been, like, for example, we've got, St. Francis of Assisi here, just the closest guy to me. And so perhaps there are people in Assisi, this area in Italy, that are particularly devoted to him, and their veneration of him could sometimes blur the line and almost look like a worship of Francis over Jesus. And so that's where these terms of cults begin to start forming, because some people would say, well, there's a cult of Francis because they spend a little too much time on Francis and not on Jesus. I'd seen a documentary, and they were interviewing a priest in Vatican City, and he had to laugh that when you ask Italians who they pray to, at this time there was a survey, this is probably 10, 15 years ago, but who do they pray to? And Jesus was third on the list, right? So we may be talking into that category of why there's the misconception that Roman Catholics worship saints. So all of that to get back to the term cult originated with this idea of a formal religious veneration. So, as I said, the cult of Francis, right? So, yeah, that's where we're at. And another idea between a religious idea of cult, there was something that was unorthodox or something that was spurious, something that just happened, right? That happened very quickly in this form of devotion. And that's not unlike how we use that term somewhat today. But the term was later kind of adopted in a sociological world, not a theological world, as a derogative term. And that would have started happening early in the 20th century. So the term cult versus the term religion really can come down to this idea of how much time has passed, right? Which I'm going to get into a little bit more, but this idea that something, when it began, was seen as a cult, as time has passed and it's become more established and more decentralized, worked its way into a religion, okay? So really, before cult being now a dirty word, new movements like to use the term new religious movement, right? So they don't want to be called a cult, they want to be called a new religious movement. And about 2,000 years ago, there was this guy who walked the earth, and a new religious movement formed around him. Do you have any guesses of who I'm talking about here? If you guess Jesus, that's always the setup, is that the children's sermon, the setup is always that the answer is going to be Jesus. So you got it right. The answer is Jesus. Jesus was this guy from Nazareth, and the people at the time who were not sold on him being fully God and fully human just thought he was a new cult leader, right? And so there was this idea that these Nazareans who followed this Nazarene were part of this cult, right? So even the earliest movement of Jewish Christians would have been seen as a cult by some people, right? They were these fanatics, these devotees to this Jesus of Nazareth, right? And then about 1,500 years later, about 500 years ago, this other guy pops up, and he starts a new religious movement, and people probably thought he was a cult leader at the time too. I'm talking, of course, about the church father of our namesake here in the church I serve, but Martin Luther, right? So Martin Luther starts the Protestant Reformation, which is a huge thing that has affected the whole world. This now 500 years later, but at the time, there probably were people who considered people who followed Luther to be a part of a cult. And for that matter, any reformers who came after him, whether it was Calvin or Wesley or Henry VIII, right? These guys were the new cult leaders. Zwingli, take your pick. But as time passed and they became more established, right? So you take the followers of Jesus, who, grew exponentially in the first 500 years of their existence. By, the 400s are taken seriously as a religion and not just a cult anymore. And they're no longer they were no longer Jewish Christians at that point. They just became Christians. Same thing with Luther. As time caught on and more people, and more comes into play than religion, property and governments and all sorts of stuff. But as time went on, that original cult, because Lutheran used to be a derogatory term. You need to understand that. Lutheran was a derogatory term. And So, that early, what would have appeared to be a cult, later turned out to be a religious movement. And so, that's how the differentiation when we talk about cults versus religion in namesake, at least. We're going to get more into cults, but in namesake, it's about a passage of time, right? And so, something that starts as a cult ultimately can become a religion. That ultimately leads us to one that I want to clear up right away, but we talk about Mormonism. And a lot of people want to pick on the Mormons, and I don't want to pick on the Mormons because I know lots of good people who are Mormons. But Mormonism was something that certainly started as a cult behind Joseph Smith, and now is recognized as a religion. And people still call it a cult, but you will not catch me on video doing that because out of respect to my friends who are part of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So I will let you all debate if you think Mormonism is still a cult, but I'm not going to waste my time here today doing that because, as I said, again, just like these other movements I spoke of, started one way, has now blossomed into something different. We also have to talk about this term. Typically, when you hear the word cult today, you think of people being a part of a cult of personality, right? And so that's a characteristic of a cult that we're going to get to here in just a second. But, cult of personality is not limited to the theological world, right? It's not just limited to new religious movements. You can see cults of personality in government, the way people become almost religiously devoted to a party or a candidate. But also, too, again, this is not just limited to new religious movements. We see cults of personality in the mainline church. And when I say mainline, I'm talking Lutheran, Presbyterian, Episcopalian, Methodist, you name it. We see cults of personality there around a leader. Now we're talking about living leaders, not about deities. And you also see it in megachurches, obviously. I'm not picking on megachurches because notice I first just said mainline churches have the problem as well. And that cult of personality begins to revolve around people losing their identity as members of that church, as members of Christ's church, and seeing themselves as members of Pastor Dave's church. Well, we go to Pastor Dave's church, and Pastor Dave serves there for 20 years, and then Pastor Dave leaves. And all of a sudden that church falls apart because they were not members of the church. They were followers of Pastor Dave. And so, like I said, we see that in mainline churches, and we especially see that in mega churches. If the leader leaves that church and the church falls apart, were they there about the church, or were they there to consume a product that was being given to them by that particular leader? So, also something to consider when we talk about cults in religion. You can have cults of personality inside of legitimate religious movements. Lots to think about here. So I want to look at this 3 markers of cult formation that was laid out back in the 80s by psychiatrist Robert J. Lifton, who used to teach at Harvard Medical School, and he wrote this paper on cult formation. He laid out these big 3. And so for something today to be considered a cult, they have to have a charismatic leader. Again, a living charismatic leader. Okay, so that gets us away from like established religion. They have a living charismatic leader who's not a deity, and that leader becomes the object of worship for the group. And that leader has no accountability. They don't answer to anybody above them. They don't answer to a board of directors. No, they are the one in control. They become the object of affection and devotion, and they have no accountability. They don't have to answer to anybody. That's one. Number 2, indoctrination of people in the group occurs through coercion or thought reform. When we throw out words like that, indoctrination through coercion and thought reform, a lot of people start using the term brainwashing, right? That's what we're talking about here. And to the point where members of the group start denying their own self-interest in favor of the interests of the leader or the group. And I think that requires some differentiation here. Because from a religious aspect, I think all religions, in some way or other, encourage us to live for the collective, right? To live for the group and to put our selfishness and our greed aside for the betterment of the group and the world. Whereas a cult perspective would be like, oh, no. You need to transfer all your money to the group. And those of us making the decisions will benefit from that. But those of you at the bottom, we'll make sure you're at least clothed and fed, right? So it's not an idea of others over self. It's more of an idea of others at a detriment to yourself in a way. I hope that makes sense. It makes sense in my head. And last but not least, big one here, last big marker, economic, sexual, or other exploitation of people in the group. And that is almost ding, 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 red flag, what you always see in major cults. Things get weird, right? And so there's some sort of exploitation that goes on, anything from child abuse to medical neglect to polygamy to other weird sex stuff like, this pops up in these groups. And so those are the big three: charismatic leader, indoctrination through coercion, and exploitation of people in one way or the other. Modern examples of cults that check all three of these boxes off. Most famously, always in the news right now, people always talking about Scientology because Scientology has got some pretty high profile people associated with it. And as we look at number one, charismatic leader, started with L. Ron Hubbard, sci-fi author turned religious group leader. Indoctrination through coercion or thought reform. Yes, big time, happens in Scientology a lot. Convinces people to get away from their families because you can't trust them. And then, of course, big in their world is not so much sexual exploitation, although some of that happened with L. Ron Hubbard, but it's really about economic exploitation, because then the adherents of Scientology become so financially invested in Scientology that they can't afford to leave. And so Scientology checks those boxes. Obviously, a lot of these conversations really started occurring in the modern era in the 70s with the advent of Jim Jones and the People's Temple, right? And so that's one that started, this is interesting, started in a good religious sense and then flipped into a cult in some ways, right? And so, when Jim Jones started the People's Temple, he started in Indianapolis, then moved out to San Francisco. They were really about breaking down color barriers and really about civil rights and all of these sorts of things. And they were really doing some amazing stuff and caring for the poor in their neighborhoods. And it was really interesting to see. But then it was no longer about the collective good. It became about your devotion to Jim Jones. And so this is where the cult of personality comes in. And so Jim Jones was always right. Jim Jones slept with, the women and the men who were part of the People's Temple as a way of asserting dominance over them. People were also economically invested. People were also indoctrinated through coercion. And so checks all those boxes very, very easily. Same sort of thing happened in Waco with the Branch Davidians down in Waco, Texas, being led by David Koresh. Again, charismatic leader, indoctrination, not as much through coercion, but maybe through thought reform and that, that sort of way. And then, of course, exploitation, more sex stuff going on in that cult as well. Last but not least that I want to bring up, and I think this is why people pick on Mormons, because they can't separate the modern LDS church from the church of old, but also the fundamentalist LDS church. And again, I'm not saying the Mormon church is perfect. That's why I'm not Mormon, nor is the Lutheran church perfect. But what I am saying is that there are distinctions to be made, that you don't always lump LDS people in with FLDS people. And so the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints, not really a tight-knit group, because there are different sects of FLDS groups who all have their own prophet, who all of those prophets think that they have the direct lifeline to God, and they all practice polygamy, right? But the biggest one that's been in the news is, I believe, Warren Jeffs, right? And so Warren Jeffs still controlling people even from prison, guilty of child marriage within his group, guilty of child exploitation, financial exploitation of the government, like just really deep web to unravel. So definitely a charismatic leader, all those things I just mentioned before. So those are big examples of cults from recent history that we can point to and say, yeah, that's a cult. That's not a new religious movement. Last but not least, there are 10 other markers that was in this one article that I liked that say, okay, those are the big three that we just talked about, but also be aware of these other 10 things. And that's how you can kind of know if this group is leaning towards that cult-like behavior or not. And remember, this cult-like behavior isn't just in the religious world. It's in the government world. It's in the social world. Like, cult of personality is everywhere, and people can become dangerously devoted to that. So these other 10 markers are like authoritarianism without accountability. You know, the leader is the supreme leader, and he doesn't have to answer to anybody. No questions or criticism of the leader or the movement. Just will not be tolerated. There's no financial disclosure from those at the top. You don't have to know what they're doing with their money, is the way they like to put it. There's a fear of the outside world, a fear of outsiders, a fear of people who are not like us that gets stoked within the group or by the leader. There's no reason to leave. Like, why would you leave? Everything's perfect here. Oh, those people that left before, they were bad. They were bad for leaving, and so good riddance to them. Former members continuously share stories of being abused by the leader or by the group, and so those corroborative stories, if you will. There just happens to be well-recorded accounts of abuse perpetrated by the leader of the group, whether it's through news articles or books or even documentaries. People in the group never feel good enough, so there's this sort of mental abuse that takes place, and that you're never living up to what the group's goals are or what the leader's goals are. The leader's always right, no matter what, and the leader is the only person in possession of the truth. And so those are 10 other markers that kind of give the idea of what makes something a cult. Again, cult of personality, social cult, government, devotion, take your pick, but those are other markers. So I have rambled on long enough, but those are just some of the differences that differentiate between cult and religion, and the passage of time, and cults and new religious movements, the difference between those two. But one last thing I want to close with was this great quote that I heard from an author named Alan Levinovitz. And Alan has made part of his life's work has been just writing books and articles, debunking sort of like this idea of charlatans. Charlatans would fall into this idea of people who perpetrate a cult of personality. I wish I would have looked up the origin of the word charlatan, but in just debunking frauds is something he has made a living out of. And something to be aware of, painfully aware of, is that people who are part of cults get very, very, very defensive when you criticize their leader. Again, whether that's in a church, whether that's in a social circle, whether that's a political figure, the people, when you criticize their leader, and this shows you what could be some cult of personality-like behavior, Alan Levinovitz says, if you attack the charlatans, they've been turned into saints by the people that look up to them. So that when you attack them, the charlatans, you also end up attacking all of the people that believe them. And I think that's some of the danger behind getting so wrapped up into this cult-like behavior, is that people see criticism of the leader as criticism against them personally. And so just in closing, that's one more tidbit I would add to this marker of differences between religions, cults, or even new religious movements. And so didn't get into cults that lead to violence, although that's very common. They're not common, but it happens with some of these groups. So yeah, there's the well of my research for the day and the well of my history and experience of reading about some of these things. And I hope it's been informative, and I hope it answered some of your questions. And so again, a reminder, if you've got anything you want me to explore, write in. Be glad to write, do a little homework and make a video when I've got the time. Don't always have the time, but when I do, I enjoy doing these deep dives. And so, it's been good talking to y'all. That's all I've got for you. So may the Lord bless you and keep you until we gather again. Amen.